I'm Josh Busby. I'm an assistant professor at the LBJ School and also a Crook Distinguished Scholar at the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law. Welcome to today's event from the field, Ground Truthing Climate Vulnerability and Adaptation in Africa. I'd like to thank our invited speakers and from your own, a number of students. Ariel Schwartz on my right, John Peterek here on the left, Jared Berenter in the middle, and then Todd Smith. We're going to call all of them up in a moment to discuss their experiences doing field work in support of the CCAPS grant. As you know, the Strauss Center has a 5-year grant from the Department of Defense to study climate security in Africa. This work that the students conducted this past summer throughout southern and central Africa has really been an effort to see if a series of maps to try and identify where climate vulnerability is concentrated sort of jive with local notions of where the vulnerabilities are. So they're going to come up and talk about that momentarily, but they're also going to talk about a second component that really ties into Dr. Weaver's ongoing PRP at the moment, looking at where different projects are concentrated to deal with adaptation and prepare the continent for the vulnerabilities that they're experiencing. So what I'd like to do today is spend about the first half hour on the vulnerability side of things, and then the second half hour on the adaptation side. We're going to call each of them up one at a time to talk for about 3 minutes about the vulnerability side. I'm going to give Todd a little bit more time. He did more countries, as you'll see. And then if they exceed their time, I'm going to use the Vuvuzela to call them out. So see if I can get this application to work. I just had it. Anyway, it'll come on. It'll inopportune times and drown out their voices. Oh, I turned the sound off. That's why. Okay. So they'll get that if they go over time. Now it's going to just go off incessantly. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Jared for taking a leadership role in organizing today's session. I'd also like to thank Ashley Moran, Liz Roberts, Laura Jones, and Kaiba White from the Strauss Center for all helping make this event possible. And thanks to all of you for coming. One of the things I'd also like to mention is that if any of you are considering doing a summer internship in Africa next summer, particularly North Africa, West Africa, or Ethiopia, come see us, because there are possibilities for doing similar work that they did to ground truth the maps that we've made on vulnerability and to delve into more depth about the adaptation side of things. There may be some possibilities for small research stipends to complement other sources of funding that you might apply for, such as the Crook Fellowship. So be thinking about that, and we are delighted to have all of you here. So let me just say a word about the vulnerability maps that we've made, and you'll see some of them in the course of the presentations here. We look at vulnerability that incorporates dimensions of physical exposure to climate hazards, primarily looking at exposure to historic floods, droughts, severe weather events. But as we know, as we've seen in events in Pakistan and Haiti, some of them not climate related, but when natural hazards affect a country, whether or not that turns into a disaster really is contingent upon other dynamics at the household and government level, really. How poor communities are, what are the resources they have, and how well their governments are placed to protect them. So some of the maps you'll see actually incorporate other dimensions beyond physical exposure. But we've done these in the sense in the lab. We don't yet know if this really corresponds to where people on the ground think their vulnerabilities are, where they're exposed, where they think the risks from climate change are likely to be greatest. And so precisely for this reason, a number of students went out to various countries in the region this summer and are going to talk about what that is. So as I said, we're going to spend the first half hour on vulnerability, and then we're going to talk a bit about who's doing what on adaptation. There'll be short presentations the first 3 minutes, as I said, on vulnerability. Then we're going to have a group discussion. We're going to have short 2-minute presentations then on adaptation and a short discussion, and then there'll be ample time for Q&A at the end. So hopefully that gives us a roadmap for where we want to go, and I'll turn it over to Ariel for our first discussion on Kenya and Tanzania. So thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to be hearing this really Okay, so I was in Kenya by myself, but in Tanzania all my meetings were with Todd, actually. So we started out, actually, you know what? I'm just going to skip right to the vulnerability map so you can see the differences between what we talked about and what the map seems to show. So starting out with the coastal areas, we heard concerns about sea level rise, but in our meetings with the Danish ambassador, as well as with Yuta Kambona, who is the head of a local-based organization that does some advocacy work and adaptation projects, both indicated that there would be saltwater intrusion here, particularly in the low-lying, densely populated areas around Dar es Salaam. But the most interesting discussions, really, I think, coming out of this, and you'll see this when I talk about the rest of the areas, is there's some conflict about whether these are actually climate change-related problems or if they're more due to extractive activities and other sort of human activities. So that's here, and then we talked a little bit about the semi-arid areas here in the Maasai areas, moving from semi-arid to super-arid. And there's water scarcity issues here along in the Serengeti and Ngorongoro and some other areas in here. And as well, we see climate-related problems in that there's increasing drought, but there's also been a change of property rights and access into the game reserve. So the Maasai, who are nomadic, who typically are able to deal with to deal with water scarcity, are actually becoming less able to deal with it. So there's an interaction problem there. I met with somebody at KEMRI, who is the Kenya Medical Research Institute in Kisumu, and he deals with all projects. He's an epidemiologist looking at projects around the Lake Victoria area, and he's seeing, due to temperature increases, increased bacterial levels and increased incidence of diarrheal diseases. And then in the Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania area around the lake, he's also looking at increased malarial incidence. He's got all sorts of topographical maps that are geocoded to the household level as well as to the mosquito level. He knows where all the nests are. So he's doing that. I just want to talk really quickly about northern Kenya. When Todd and I were in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, we met with someone from CIFID who was extremely concerned about our maps that didn't really show much vulnerability in the northern Kenya area. And this is a huge. I'm just going to finish that. There's a lot of political violence there, and there's also a lot of drought there. But we see, so I met with Dan Silvey at CIFID, who in Nairobi, and he's the conflict advisor for Kenya and Somalia. And he seemed to think that if government was responsive in Kenya, anywhere it was responsive on the border here with Somalia. So he actually thought that although these drought areas are becoming even worse and water scarcity is increasing, government responsiveness is actually fine there. And the biggest threat in Kenya that he thought was vulnerability related to surrounding countries having political problems as well as climate-related problems and actually dealing with in migration because of those things. So he was actually dealing with population problems. So I think that's enough. I didn't even hear this was developed.
I didn't hear it all yet. I wanted to let you go. Jared's going to be our next speaker, and he's going to talk about his experiences in Mozambique. And then we'll get an opportunity at the end to compare and contrast differences between their experiences. I can go back.
Okay. My name is Jared Berenter. I had an opportunity to spend the summer in Mozambique. During my time there, I spoke with, several people, Department for International Development, which is, the British equivalent of USAID, CARE, World Wildlife Fund, African Development Bank, and I actually had an opportunity to meet with an official from the Ministry of Planning and Development. That particular ministry is beginning to take a kind of an increased, expanded role in dealing with climate events. Climate variability in Mozambique is exactly that. It's exactly as the word would imply. Climate varies in magnitude, in frequency, and across the full range of extreme weather events. So basically, the problems that they experience are drought, flooding, cyclone activity, and sea level or saltwater inundation on the coast. Drought is the most frequent natural disaster, and you see that primarily in this region here, which is Gaza and Inhambane is here on the coast. But also up by the Zambezi River, which you can't see it, but it's about right here, they also experience drought, and that's actually where it's most economically impacting. That's where the biggest economic consequences are felt. Flooding is primarily a problem mostly in river basins. The Zambezi River is right here, and then there's the Limpopo River right here, that both experience pretty significant flooding every year, every 2 years, and then on a larger scale every 5 years, and I guess every 50 years. Tropical cyclones you see up here, and that's actually on CCAP's maps. That's where I guess according to our variables, that's where it's most vulnerable. But that didn't seem to be at the forefront of people's attention, People seem to be more concerned about rivers here and here. I guess aside from physical exposure to climate, people on the ground were primarily concerned with roads, so road and transport infrastructure, and agriculture. 80% of Mozambicans live off of subsistence agriculture, and so are very vulnerable. And to exacerbate that, 60% live along the coast. There's about 2,700 miles of coastline, and so you can only imagine what problems that creates as the sea level slowly starts to creep in. The city, I guess, experiencing the most significant problems with saltwater inundation is data right here, which I'll talk about later.
And John Peterek is going to talk about his experiences in Malawi.
Great. So I had the opportunity to travel to Malawi this summer to actually do a little work for CCAP, but more importantly, I got to visit my wife, who was working on a project there a little longer, and so it was exciting to get to see her and to visit Malawi for the first time. It's an incredible place, and I was honored to be able to do a little bit of work while I was there. So I did some interview work in Lilongwe, and where I met, which is the capital, where I met with USAID, with JIPSA as well, with Irish Aid, with Total Land Care, with the World Bank office there as well. And it seems like that the work that is headed out of Lilongwe is all concentrated kind of in accordance with these maps in the south of the country. So this is where a lot of the population of Malawi lives, and it's all centered on the Shire River, which is in this area. And so it's heavily populated. It's driven by agriculture, and so periods of intense rain followed by drought make this the most vulnerable part of Malawi. And that was identified not only by one source, but multiple sources kept identifying this area as well. And then also the bordering regions of the lake here. So people, again, are tied to agriculture who live in this region. And the increasing level of the lake and the decreasing level of the lake, so the fluctuation there causes some issues for bordering communities as well. So agriculture is the big story, and this is the region that the vulnerability is the greatest.
Well, Todd's going to cap off this first discussion of vulnerability, and he went to a number of different countries, including, as mentioned, spent a little time in Tanzania, but spent some time in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Namibia. So he'll talk a little bit more broadly about some other countries as well.
Okay, I don't know where. So, as Josh just said, I started in Cape Town, and that was academics at University of Cape Town and some people at the municipality of Cape Town. Then went to Dar es Salaam, where Ariel and I conducted some interviews, and then came back to Johannesburg and Pretoria, where I conducted some interviews at the University of Johannesburg, and Jared and I did some work with DFID, and we went to a REACTO meeting. And then I traveled up through Zimbabwe and Zambia, and then over to Namibia. And I guess, so these are, met with 61 people, I think, and you can see that most of them were in South Africa, and most of them with donor organizations. But that's just to give you an idea of the breakdown, so full disclosure. So the two things that kept coming up over and over again for me in meetings were that people were vulnerable because of two main reasons: food insecurity and displacement by floods. Now, those two drivers of vulnerability, or I shouldn't say drivers, those two mechanisms of vulnerability operate differently in urban areas and rural areas. And so that obviously makes the concerns and policy issues very different for a place like South Africa, which has pretty decent agricultural infrastructure, versus Zambia, which does not, or Zimbabwe, where governance has completely collapsed over the past 10 years. So when we're talking about rural areas, rainfall variability obviously affects crop production when those crops are rain-fed crops. And that seems to be the biggest concern in Zambia and Zimbabwe, and also in Tanzania. But there, like Ariel's already mentioned, there are some other issues in Tanzania. So geographically, in the top north of Zambia is dry, but a lot of the area up there is also, you can see this big white spot right there. I should use the laser pointer. Right there is a national park, so there's no people there. That's why it's white. So you get the same types of things going on here where Kruger National Park is. Yeah, I'm going to move on. So in urban areas, which Cape Town, Johannesburg, informal poverty, informal settlements or in poverty is a big issue. Places where there's no government services. So we ran into this in Tanzania, where our contact at the Danish embassy said that the urban poor are the most vulnerable to climate change. And he was speaking of an area in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, called Jangwani, which floods when the high tide comes in and pushes water one way, and the river is pushing water the other way, and it just pretty much makes a big pool in the neighborhood. And because there's no sewerage, disease breaks out, and you've seen these stories over and over again, but probably most recently in Pakistan and Niger. And that's a concern on the Cape Flats in Cape Town, down here, in some informal settlements in Johannesburg. I need to go faster. So like I already mentioned, Zimbabwe, the biggest concerns are government capacity. They just don't have the capacity to do anything. It's just collapsed in the past 10 years. And also the agricultural infrastructure has collapsed after the takeover of white farms by Mugabe's regime. I think I'll leave it there. So coming in South Africa, better agricultural capacity, but water scarcity is huge. They don't have enough water scarcity. So some of the people at University of Johannesburg were saying that maybe they have enough water capacity for somewhere between 60, maybe up to 80,000 people if they use it, 80 million people if they use it wisely, and they're already at about 49 to 50 million people. So that's, it's hard to make, I don't know where those calculations are coming from, and I don't know who calculated them because I haven't been able to find them to replicate them, but that's a big concern. Rapid urbanization is a problem. In-migration from other countries, particularly Zimbabwe, is a serious problem. We saw xenophobia in townships in 2008. If we get more climate migrants, that's obviously going to be a problem, although a little bit more indirect problem. So then, which moves me to Namibia, which the concerns are a little bit different. Namibia is the country with the highest inequality in the world, at least by the Gini measure. 70% lives in this area in the north, and 50% in 4 provinces right here. And there's very, very poor. Windhoek is a city of about 300,000 people that is, for all intents and purposes, Western functioning city with some poverty on the outskirts. So it's starkly different. I didn't get to go to the north, unfortunately. I would love to get to go up there, but it's difficult. It's expensive to travel in it. So how do you make people where the industry is, and the diamond mines are down, and fishing is also a big driver, a big economic boom. How do you make these people concerned about those people? Governance is a disconnect. So I think I'll leave it there because I've got to do stuff.
All right. Well, great. Well, I'd like to call all four panelists up, and we'll have a brief discussion about similarities and differences between these different findings. I mean, one of the interesting things that throughout the whole region is, when we compare it to the rest, you might have seen from some of the other maps that some of the countries bordering the region look to and appear to be more vulnerable based on our maps, like the Democratic Republic of Congo. Here, Zimbabwe appears a bit more vulnerable, but the lightest colors, not the white colors, which are unpopulated areas, but the lightest colors, like what appears over most of Namibia, South Africa, Kenya, and Zambia, suggests that much of the region, when you combine all dimensions of our vulnerability indices, aren't particularly vulnerable. And that what Ariel suggested is that maybe we're not quite picking up on northern Kenya's vulnerability, and I wanted to see, on average, John suggested that we did a pretty good job in our mapping exercise to capture Malawi's vulnerability in the south, but on balance, in terms of, have we underplayed the region's vulnerability? We often hear that Southern Africa is perhaps the most vulnerable, but given the other dimensions of, compared to the rest of the continent, governance is a little better, Zimbabwe notwithstanding. So I just wanted to see what your thoughts are in terms of, how much of a disconnect there was between what the maps represented for the countries that you looked at and what they ought to represent based on the people you talked to. And feel free, anybody who wants to weigh in on that question.
I'll start if that's okay. So whoever I showed the maps to, for the most part, seemed to agree. On the local level, and by local I mean within the nation. So if I showed the map as Namibia to someone in Namibia, they're going to say, well, yes, the north is the most vulnerable. Now, there might be some disagreement about whether the north of Namibia is more vulnerable or less vulnerable than somewhere in Niger or Chad or some other part of the map, someone that's further away. I think there's general agreement that governance in Angola is not as good as what it is in Namibia either. So there's that. So within the country, it certainly agreed, with the exception of northern Kenya. I think was the biggest glaring, the biggest criticism that we had, and that came up not just in meetings in Kenya, but also meeting with people in Pretoria who are more concerned with the entire region. It's more difficult to make cross-country comparisons, I think. Especially when you're talking to someone who is working within the country and that is their focus. So I don't know if that helps.
Because Jared, you also pointed out that you thought that some of the maps might not quite represent the local vulnerabilities in the way that you experience, especially along river basins. Other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, most of the people I talked to thought that the vulnerability was a function of exposure and not so much governance. Mozambique gets very high, or at least not bad, rankings in terms of governance indicators. So I think that kind of skews the map a little bit. People seem to be more concerned about actual exposure to extreme weather. So if you look at the rivers on the map, there's you don't see very much dark brown. And then if you look at Beta, it's just which is on the coast, you only see little speckles of dark brown. Most of the brown on the map is up in the north, which there are NGOs who are concerned about the north, particularly because of for conservation efforts or because of cyclone activity. But the consensus was not that at least I didn't feel that the north was most vulnerable.
Yeah, so I guess there may be something about adequacy of coverage, whether it's about some of the indicators that include. Other thoughts that anybody else want to weigh on this question?
Sure. I took a different approach. I didn't have the map that you guys had created. I had a blank map and had people illustrate, where they thought the places that were vulnerable were and why that was so. And, so I thought it was pretty telling to see, the map that was produced by CCAPS compared to what people were saying and how it was matching up repeatedly. And I think that that's a testament on the other side of the map. So.
Listening to Todd speak when he brought up rain-fed agriculture, I think that's a huge mechanism for vulnerability in Mozambique, and particularly given the impact of climate on water patterns. I think it logically makes sense.
Okay. Other similarities, other differences?
I agree with that, and everybody seemed to talk about infrastructure. I mean, infrastructure is a huge problem. Jared talked about the lack of infrastructure in Mozambique. As I understand, actually exports ag production out of the south and imports it in to the north. So
You're talking about food?
Moving it within the country.
Rather than moving it within the country.
Right.
Because there's just not enough, it's just too expensive to move it from the north to the south, or south to the north.
Yeah, actually another thing that I didn't mention before is a big complaint that donor organizations and the government have in Mozambique is trouble with water management, because most of the water originates upstream in other countries. So they have 9 major rivers that reach the Indian Ocean, so they're big rivers, but originate in other countries. And so if Zambia, for example, shuts down its water supply and doesn't let water through, then Mozambique suffers for that. And on the flip side, if Zambia has too much water and they let it all through, then Mozambique likewise suffers from that.
And that's an important thing that's echoed in the Southern Regional Group from last year's PRP, a paper that will be coming out from the Strauss Center later this fall. We're currently processing those, but Sarah Williams and Sachin Shah and Xu Yang were heavily involved in that work, and you'll see the light of day with that project very soon. So, but the theme of regional water management is important.
Can I also heard that when I was in Zambia, and there is a regional river cooperation agency called ZAMCOM, the Zambezi Commission, I think, that is due to be re-upped, and the Zambia officials are the holdup because they lay claim to 40% of Zambezi's water, but they're vulnerable from Angola, and they cause vulnerability in Mozambique. So there's huge cooperation issues, I think, around that.
I want to ask one more question related to the vulnerability side, and then we'll turn to adaptation and then open it up pretty quickly thereafter to Q&A. Ariel alluded to the sort of regional concerns about in-migration, I think, and Jared talked about the potential regional management issues associated with water. And the migration side of things kind of gets you thinking about the security challenges, and we are funded by the DoD, but a lot of this is focused on sort of basic human security issues of people's welfare at the local level, but less so about, is this going to contribute to conflict or the kinds of security outcomes that we might be concerned about in terms of maybe military mobilization for humanitarian relief. Did any of that kind of the sort of security concerns manifest themselves in discussions with people, or was it mostly more prosaic in terms of, do people have enough water, do they have more food, with less thought about sort of the follow-on consequences for government?
Yeah, this isn't something that I directly talked about with people, but Mozambique is on the tail end of, or is just shortly removed from a very violent civil conflict, which ended about, I guess, 16 years ago. From my understanding, this wasn't from talking to people, or from talking through my interviews, but from actually talking to people in Mozambique. My understanding is that Renamo, who was the rebel army, controlled the center of the country, and Frelimo controlled the north and the south. And I thought it was interesting. You can't see it on this map, but the donor community has chosen Beta as a site to test out many of its climate resistance policies, and Beta is in the center where Renamo used to have its stronghold. So it seems like what I would have anticipated to be a security concern between two factions that are just recently removed from conflict has not, at least yet, turned out to be so.
So we'll come back to that when we start talking about adaptation in a few minutes, about where governments are concentrating their resources. But any other further thoughts about the broader security consequences of these vulnerabilities? Anybody else want to weigh in?
I think I briefly mentioned the REACSO meeting, which is Regional Interagency. It's a, what was it? Coordinating. In fact, they were part of a meeting was how to rename it. So, but it's a bi-weekly meeting or weekly meeting amongst humanitarian aid organizations and bilateral donor organizations in Pretoria to coordinate their efforts in the region. And this was 2 weeks before the end of the World Cup, or no, it was only a week into the World Cup.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Yes.
And they were very much on their radar was the possibility of renewed xenophobic violence after the World Cup, because they had actually received warnings about that, that they were going to, behave that people, whoever they are, were going to behave themselves during the World Cup. But as soon as that was over, they were going to start again. Luckily, it didn't happen to the scale that it was feared it would. So that's a big driver. Some people in Namibia at the embassy spoke about regional cooperation again, especially over water. And while there's never been a real water war, I guess that's a little bit debatable, there is certainly a possibility for conflict over water.
Any other final thoughts from anybody about the security stuff before we turn to adaptation?
Yeah, I mean, the Kenyan government seems to be, at least in the example that you just referred to, not really dealing much with any in-migrants now, and the representative, the conflict advisor that I spoke with at DFID didn't seem to expect the government to deal with any additional in-migrants in terms of mediating any resource concerns. So probably from a human security standpoint, any scarce resource issues that exist already in northern Kenya are going to be exacerbated if that immigration that they expect actually happens. Now, there are a couple groups that seem to be coming further south into Kenya, and that's going to be a security concern, both for a human security point of view as well as from the government security. And those are, I guess, a group called the Brand from southern Ethiopia seems to be trickling further south into where population is more dense, as well as some Somalis.
Interesting. Well, if you're familiar with the broader mapping paper that we wrote, Ethiopia strikingly shows up across almost all dimensions of our sort of risk vulnerability indicators, and that poses, as you suggest, maybe some challenges for its neighbors. Well, let's turn our attention to adaptation. I'm sort of interested in hearing, based on your conversations, who's doing what and your sense of interesting adaptation projects that have emerged. We'll talk about that maybe one at a time, again, starting with Ariel, and then have a conversation and then open it up to Q&A shortly thereafter. So, Ariel?
Sure. So in Kenya and Tanzania, the interesting standpoint from at least the donor's perspective, it seems like, is that there's some sort of conflict between what's actually a climate-related problem and what's just a general development problem. And Todd and I found this as well when we met with the local community-based group as well, and they do adaptation projects as well, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But I guess a lot of that conflict seems to stem from the fact that aid has been noted as supposed to be additional if it's climate-related, and so governments in the region seem to be trying to make an argument that a lot of security concerns are actually climate-related concerns, and so making an argument for additional funding, whereas the Danish ambassador seemed to, he told this story about Kilimanjaro, for example, which is losing its permafrost
at the top of the mountain, but there's 250-year winds that seem to be, very typically blowing it to the side of the mountain. And there's a deforestation story that would really prevent, they say these funds shouldn't really be activated for that. And then the other part of that story is that the donors seem to say, well, look, the environment's not a sector, so all the aid for adaptation should really be incorporated into the development strategies of these countries anyway. And we saw that a little bit. I saw some of that skepticism in Kenya on just sitting in bus stations, watching the news about flooding, for example, in Ahero, which is a couple hours south of the city of Kisumu. That this is something that happens every single year, and people are very well aware of flooding, and anybody who sticks around there is just generating income from these adaptation projects because they look attractive from a climate change perspective. But at the same time, the Ahero in particular has this really neat rice irrigation project that's trying to make use of this of the regularized flooding and what seems to be an increased flooding, and we see in Western Kenya there's probably additional rains. And then in Kenya we met with, so this group was called the Environmental Protection and Management Service. In Tanzania, thanks. And they do advocacy as well as action research on all sorts of projects in Tanzania, and seem to be very well connected with regional and continental adaptation projects, and we can talk about them later, I guess.
Jared?
Yeah, I guess along the lines of narrowing that distinction between adaptation and other forms of aid, the talk coming from everybody that I interviewed was about mainstreaming climate change into, into the policy discourse. On a lot of different levels. One, integrating disaster risk with climate resilience, doing so both the national level and the local level, and then integrating climate change into the budget. And a lot of this was a result of a new pilot project that is being implemented by several donor banks. But it has pretty real consequences. The Ministry of Planning and Development has acquired a lot of new authority in its budgetary process because it's now managing things that are climate related, things that are environmentally related, whereas before that was part of within the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Environment. With regard to the second part of your question, there are some interesting adaptation projects ranging from actually relocating communities to more drought or flood resistant areas. The African Development Bank will I think it was DFID, will provide financial incentives for people to stay in the new locations, and people seem to be pretty happy with that. There were, it was CARE, talked about a few projects. One, they found a new rat that supposedly is more drought resistant than other forms of food. This creates its own problems because people have started slashing and burning forest areas to root out these rats. Let's see what else. There were some interesting things going on. The Institute for Meteorology was doing something as simple as trying to digitalize its data. So it has weather data from ranging back decades that's it's old, it's worn down, it's not put into any sort of digital system, and so they've received a huge grant from DANITA, which is the Danish Foreign Department of their Foreign Affairs ministry, and so they're working to do that. So I guess that's just a few examples.
John?
Yeah. So I would say in Malawi that the donor agencies have gotten together and are really coordinating their efforts. So there's a group of people led by USAID, by DFTA, by Irish Aid that have a working group on all the adaptation projects that they're funding within the country. So there's a real sort of sense of cohesion and mission on what they're going to work on. And some of the things that I found that were interesting, two projects I would like to highlight that they're working on. And one is at Bunda College, which is the agriculture college in Malawi. So they have created a curriculum and are funding research and academic people to put in place a piece of curriculum that every student that goes through Boone College will encounter, not only education about climate change, but then about some sort of basic things that farmers can do to help adapt to the changing climate of what they're growing and where they're growing it. So I thought that was pretty novel. And then the other one I'd like to highlight is this NGO called Total Land Care. And they work in the south of the country, so the area that was sort of the most vulnerable on the map, and they work around protected areas. So they go to communities that border protected areas, and to convince them to stop deforestation, they set up tree growing and harvesting plots for the community. So the community can pick a piece of land, and they'll set up a stand of trees that they can then harvest from for firewood for their community. And then if they have extra, they can use that extra as a source of income generation for the community. So all the while protecting the area that's right near it, and there's some incentive not to because they have this new piece. So I thought that was pretty good. And then as well, the government of Malawi has just constructed regional food storage silos, so to help be ready for when there is massive drought, so that there's strategically located places. So those are three pretty good deals.
I don't know where to start. Just to take it back a little to the meta level a little bit more, when I would start asking people about this, I basically had three questions that I would try to structure the conversation around, because they're conceptual questions that I still haven't been able to get my head around. Basically, the first one is, how does adaptation fit in traditional development aid? And I think how to mainstream it in there, and there's a recognition, at least amongst everybody that I've talked to, that in the past, in the history of development aid, people have really assumed the climate to be constant, and we just can't do that anymore. You can't assume that the climate is going to be the same in an area that you're working 20 years from now as it is now. So you have to consider that when you set up your development project, any development project, whether it's climate change adaptation or not. Secondly, what is the role for adaptation in natural resource management, or vice versa? I didn't get a chance to get into it, but on my list was, this is a big issue in say, Namibia, which is recognized to be where biodiversity is fragile and is becoming more fragile with climate change. So how to integrate those concerns into, I only have 2 minutes for this, into development planning. How do you set up fences in game preserves that develop environmental tourism or hunting tourism, and game meat, which is less intensive and is more drought resistant than cattle, say. So that's good, but then how does that work with the local communities who rely on hunting and still rely on hunting, and especially in the north? How do you deal with those issues? And thirdly, can adaptation and mitigation really be separated? If the economy is going to change, then really isn't that just adapting to a new type of economy? And Yusra Kabona in Tanzania, when we met too, so she's a good example, because they have, they do a lot of community-based indigenous adaptation, with storing grain above fire, and the smoke keeps the bugs out. But she also has a CDM specialist on staff, so they're working on, anybody who knows anything about Plain Development Mechanism, which is a mitigation tool that it can be used to help countries develop as well. I have all kinds of other things that I want to, just real quickly on the mainstreaming point. So two of the things that really brought that home to me was Sophia Betancourt, who works for the World Bank in Zambia. It was attributed to her by somebody else, says that the climate change adaptation is the difference between if you're building a bridge, and previously you might have built it to withstand a 20-year flood, now you're going to build it to withstand a 50-year flood. The difference in the cost between the 20-year flood and the 50-year flood bridge, that should be attributed to climate change. Now, how do you separate that out? I don't know. And Penny Price had in the in Cape Town she works in the municipal offices in Cape Town, had a good example as well. If we're concerned about spread of wildfires because of drying and lack of water, then perhaps the best use of funds is to build up the capacity of the fire brigade. But since when is more money for the fire brigade considered climate change adaptation? So how do you separate those things? I'd like to talk about conservation farming in Zambia, I'm going to talk about conservation farming in Zambia.
So on that note, I want to open it up to questions, because I know you have some burning questions. So rather than have me continue a moderated discussion, let me field some questions. We'll take several, and then we'll collect several, and then have the panelists respond. So who's got some questions? Yeah, right here.
Hi. I'm just interested to know a bit more about how you guys went and gathered your information. So how did you select your interviewees? And were you based mainly in capitals, or were you able to get outside of the capital? And also, it seems from the discussion, and it could be wrong, that you mainly spoke with international donors as opposed to national actors. And so why was that the case?
Okay, let me take a few more along those lines. Other questions? Yeah, right here.
Yeah, more about the next great map there that shows the data that was forecasted, and then you were integrating with the done on the ground. How was the final comparison made as far as the qualitative data you gathered and perhaps the quantitative data that you're showing?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, right here.
Can we go back to the Kenya, Tanzania map just for a second? With questions about that. So if you look here, it looks like, at border's edge, suddenly things get a lot better in Kenya. Is it that the government of Kenya has great policies, or the data is bad? That's the question.
Right. Okay, right here.
Actually, I'm just going to add on to that question, because I made the same observation. And that seems to suggest to me that your governance indicator is a huge factor.
Mm-hmm.
Since right across borders, you see huge differences.
Yeah.
And so, how are you measuring governance, and how confident are you that you're sort of capturing that properly? Because, I mean, after all, we would have said the U.S. has good governance before Katrina, right? But that was a flop. So, how do you know that the indicator you're using really means that government can actually adapt to such changes?
Take one more, and then we'll have the panel respond, and I might have to weigh in, and then I'll give myself a good Mandela. All right, here.
I'm glad right of that, because it's very ironic given that Tanzania, I believe, has a higher governance rating on the World Bank governance indicators that you're using in Kenya. So this is especially puzzling, because they're just scoring higher on vulnerability in Tanzania and better in Kenya. So maybe it's not governance, it's something else that's going on here. But secondly, to ask about the methodology question, I'm wondering, as students, how do you find that in terms of getting access, getting people to talk to you? Were they ready, willing, and able? Were they really excited about this topic? Were they very concerned about climate change? Or did you get sort of an apathetic response? What was the fieldwork experience like?
Let me turn to the panel and take any or all of those if you want to. Anybody want to weigh in on any of those elements? And then I may, at the end, say a little bit about the methods. That's my fault. Their problems there.
I would start with her question. I had an opportunity to meet with a few. Most of the people I met with were Mozambicans, but they're working for the international donor community. I did meet with one ministry official and one person from a local NGO, but one of the overwhelming problems in Mozambique is there's a knowledge deficit about climate change, and so the people who bring this knowledge and bring the resources to deal with it is the international community, and so I think that's part of the reason that this is so heavily weighted towards that group of people. But I did manage to make it out of the capital, but not to do interviews. Most of the donor community they travel a lot, so they're back and forth from Maputo to Beira to Nampula or wherever it may be. But
when we met with Nickel, I think, we talked about why people in Tanzania are Tanzanians and why Kenyans are their ethnic group first, or and a lot of that goes back to Julius Nyerere, he's very early on after, this may be a little bit more detail than we need, but very early on after independence, he set up that all primary education will be in Swahili and secondary education is English. And he attributed that to creating a Tanzanian national identity that I think helps with a lot, especially the voice and accountability world governance issues on that. What it doesn't help with, however, is some of the poverty issues that are measured on administrative lines, and poverty is certainly still worse in Tanzania. It still has a very low GDP per capita. Although that's not in our measures, the poverty certainly does. I don't know. I'll let Josh take it from there.
But it's economic indicators that are driving these outcomes, not the governance indicators.
Likely.
Yeah, so we have a number of household indicators in terms of access to education and health and just basic health standards. And if there's a large discrepancy between Tanzania and Kenya, and given that those, as Todd suggested, if those are collected at best on a sort of provincial level, administrative level, you'll end up with large differences between two countries that are a function of the data. So it may not be driven by our governance indicators, which include two national level indicators from the World Governance Indicators, two indicators of political stability from Polity 4, and then the only subnational data at the governance level that we currently have incorporated is based on political atrocities. We're going to incorporate another level that in the next iteration that maybe has more fine-grained data from the armed conflict location and events data set, which we've just paid to have expanded continent-wide, which probably has both attacks on civilians and sort of civil conflict type events. The interesting thing was to pick up on some of the recent political violence in Kenya. We've just gotten that data, so we haven't really processed it. But to a certain extent, some of this could be an artifice of the data that we use. But I don't want to take up too much time on that, because really just want to give the rest of the panel an opportunity to maybe address that last question about, what was it like to do field work for the project, and if there's time, we can collect some additional questions at the end. So
yeah, I'm sorry. Can I respond to Jen Hazen's question, although she's not in there?
That's what I was going to respond to.
Okay, go ahead.
No, well, I was just going to say that, who we met with and why. I met with not only donors but also NGOs that are actually, conducting the actual adaptation projects that are ongoing in Malawi. And the people I met with, a bunch of them were Malawian national people. They just work for, agencies. And that, I got to travel around the country, but that really the center of, where things happen and these offices are all in the capital. Even though I was able to travel on my own and see the populated southern part where a lot of people live, to have an interview and to get someone to sit down with you, it was kind of hard to catch them in the field. You had to meet them in their offices if you were going to meet them. So, yeah.
So I was going to say exactly the same thing. Even one of the same things, that even though you see when you see organizations, if we're meeting with DFID or meeting with the Norwegian Embassy, I don't know if I know the Finnish Embassy, whatever. It doesn't mean that it wasn't nationals in the country, because the ambassador or consular who will refer you to his staff. So it's a little bit misleading. And so, and if you're meeting with a local organization, some of those people are international. So we'd have to get a little bit deeper to talk about when they're nationals and when they're not. As far as the capacity coming from international community, that's definitely true. I think it's certainly the local people, local governments. You saw on my chart that I met with very few government officials outside of South Africa that are concerned about this issue, because they really have more pressing things on their mind. And to the extent that they are thinking about climate change adaptation, it's to get money. And that also came up with NGOs. Sometimes they would meet with me because they thought that I might have the ability to give them money, which I didn't. So I had to be very clear about that. How we found people, I shotgun emails just started last March, just sending out a bunch of emails to anybody and everybody that I could get email addresses for, and it starts to snowball, and it certainly starts to snowball when you're on the ground in the city, and it can get rather hectic when they say you need to meet with such and such, but they're leaving the country tomorrow. So,
yeah, I think from a fieldwork perspective, being on the ground made all the difference in the world in the connections of who you needed to interview. I think that once you were there and I worked off an initial lead that Todd gave me, but that turned into a tree, rather large tree, just by being there in person one day. And so I think that it's one thing to communicate from afar, and it was helpful to get some initial things set up, but it really made a huge difference to be there and for them to meet you and to understand who you were and what you were really up to.
And in response to Dr. Weaver's question, I think that it didn't really seem so difficult getting access and setting up an initial interview being a student. It seemed more as though that yeses or nos were driven by availability as opposed to the fact that we were, that was my introduction to the project, really. So that was, I wasn't really even a researcher on it at the time. But as far as the quality of the substance that we collected goes, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that I wonder if maybe Todd has more experience, so maybe he can have a better formed opinion about it. But I wonder if the fact that we were students. I mean, I think that we got a lot of, especially in Tanzania, a lot of unofficial opinions about what the donors thought about the government, maybe because it wasn't such a formal meeting. But as far as the quality of the information goes, I'm not sure, and I think that might have been more driven by who we met with. I think some of the people we met with were really direct. They were totally exactly the right person to be dealing with. Who are dealing with these issues, but for example, at the African Development Bank, I'm not sure that, in Tanzania, that we had, it was sort of a waste of a meeting. Well, it wasn't. It was in the sense that we didn't really get any real information about what the African Development Bank is doing, but I suspect it was less because we met with the wrong person and more because they might not be they don't have a fully formed agenda on the issue.
As a learning opportunity for all of you, maybe we could end up with just sort of how did you find it in terms of your overall educational experience here at LBJ? Where does it fit?
It was a great experience. I think to be in the field and to work around an issue like this. It's something that you learn on the job way more than you could, talk about getting ready for. There's all sorts of multicultural issues. There's, just a multitude of things that you can learn from being in a meeting face to face with someone talking about their country. I think it was really rewarding.
When I was trying to set up my slate of interviews, I was all over the internet, and in one meeting with DFID, I found out just a world of things that I never even knew was out there. So it really opened things up because these organizations document a lot of things. They document everything, but it's not out there for the public eye. And so speaking with these people, I learned about things that organizations were doing that I just had no prior.
Right. This is particularly true, I think, on the adaptation project side, because a lot of the adaptation projects are being funded by the donors, but they're being run by super local organizations, and they're not. And the donors, and if we want to know about them, the donors have to put them on their websites because these organizations don't. Right. They might have static websites, or they might not have websites at all, but they're really not updating them and not making the connections on their websites between their activities and the donors' dollars.
Well, they're sort of focused on what they have to do for the donor.
Yeah, exactly.
And what their project is, not about telling the world about it. They have.
So if you're actually sitting in their office,
and then you can have that conversation. Yeah, exactly.
Then you can make those connections a lot easier.
I will say it's frustrating only having that one interview, and you have an hour to learn everything that you're looking to know, and so you hear people talking about mangroves in the north, and you're never going to see that, unless you're committed for the long term to to be in Mozambique or in whichever country it may be. So, I mean, it can be problematic in that sense, but on the whole, I thought it was a fantastic experience.
Todd, you have anything about?
I would just echo all of those points. There's certainly things that you find out on the ground that you can't get from the internet, even in this day and age. Like this woman, Euster Cabona, we would have never found that. She's not on the internet. We would never have found her organization, and they're doing.
Yeah, they have a huge
not huge
operation.
scale stuff, but it's on the edge. It's excellent work, and we only found out about her because Axel Jerkin at GTZ said,
You should call this
woman,
lady.
she did a presentation at this thing that we had, and you should really talk to her.
Yeah.
And that was terrific. And I found the same thing happened when I was in Harare. I found out about Zero. Then there's some maps that I was going to show, but I ran out of time. That are doing some mapping work in Zimbabwe that we would have never found out about if not for being there and somebody saying you need to meet with this person because they're good. As far as being very frustrating, that's also true. So those are Zero maps. It was also it can be very frustrating because going back to Jen's Hazen question, we were stuck in capitals for the most part, and when somebody mentioned excellent projects, so somebody from the Small Grants Program works out of an office at the Namibian Nature Foundation in Windhoek, but they're running programs in the north of the country, and I was like, I want to see those programs. I want to talk to the people who are running those programs, and it's a day's travel just to get up there, and it's just impossible, and it's frustrating. We did get, when Nickel talked about Jingwani, Ariel and I both in Dar es Salaam said, well, we want to go to Jingwani, and we want to see, and that became a challenge to find a driver to take us and somebody who could translate and walk us around and still be safe. So, but we did manage to do that.
Yeah,
so. But even that was a challenge. I don't know how much negotiation it took to come up with 80,000 or whatever it was.
How much it should have
We've got a little bit more time, at least on the official program, although we may want to wrap up. Are there any final questions that people have? We can collect a couple more, and then we'll wrap up, and then if people need to depart, that's also fine. But let's take a couple more, and then we'll wrap up. It officially ends at 1:45. Yeah, right here.
Sorry, just really like to know, so if you look at the metrics, how you
Yeah.
You had these surveys, you had these interviews, what came out of it at the end?
Well, let me just comment on that. Jared's going to be trying to do a report that sort of does some work to sort of look at the sort of interface between what we've mapped already and so to a certain extent, the conversation we've had today is going to feed into that report that's sort of looking at, we've done this mapping work sort of in the lab, as it were, and how does that compare with people's experiences. So this is sort of part of an ongoing effort. I would say that a lot of our indicators and the full methodologies in the report available on the Strauss Center, it is not based on projections, it's based on historic hazard exposure, plus some of the other indicators we've talked about from the World Bank, the household level. There are many challenges of getting good data that's geo-referenced for Africa, which we readily admit. But I think we're also on the edge of, if helping collect better data is of interest to you, that's one of the ongoing projects, part of Dr. Weaver's PRP. We've had students work for us in geocoding both strike and riot data, a new data set. So Sarah Williams worked with our colleagues at the University of North Texas to geocode all the strikes and riots that occurred over the last 15 or so years in Africa. That's a new data set that was created in part through student effort here. Students geocoded terrorism data as part of the North Africa work in the PRP last year. So there are all sorts of efforts that we're ongoing to try and get better geo-reference data. But then that's only part of it. And again, part of the ongoing effort, and as I advertised at the beginning of today's session, if you have intentions of doing an internship in Africa, particularly North Africa, West Africa, or Ethiopia, which are areas not covered by this cohort's work last summer, if you have an interest in doing that, there could be some serendipitous opportunities for you to do research the way all four of them were able to do last summer, to have a continued conversation about the extent to which the maps that have been done here at UT correspond with local folks' knowledge about where the vulnerabilities are concentrated. And it's an iterative process because, the data is poor. Sometimes it doesn't jive with what people, both locally know or people who are keen observers of the politics and localities of those places, what they know to be true from their own experience. And so hopefully the kinds of work that Jared's going to be working on writing this up and the subsequent efforts by you and subsequent field work will refine this, and in time maybe we'll discover these maps don't really adequately capture it. We have to go back to the drawing board in terms of methodology. But I hope that the sort of combined experience of both will lead to better quality and overall capture of the portrait of what's going on. And maybe at that we should wrap it up. But I encourage you to come up and talk to us individually and contact me or any of the other folks at the Strauss Center if you have an interest in either the fieldwork side of things or other work related to the program, because we're only in year 2 of 5. Perhaps the DoD will like it. We'll do Asia work next, and we'll be committed to this until we're all gray. So thanks so much for all of you for coming, and give our panelists a round of applause.